Like, we have to always be extraordinary. But somehow we're always doing it wrong. Like, you have to be thin, but not too thin. And you can never say you want to be thin. You have to say you want to be healthy, but also you have to be thin. You have to have money, but you can't ask for money because that's crass. You have to be a boss, but you can't be mean. You have to lead, but you can't squash other people's ideas. You're supposed to love being a mother, but don't talk about your kids all the damn time. You have to be a career woman, but also always be looking out for other people. You have to answer for men's bad behavior, which is insane, but if you point that out, you're accused of complaining. You're supposed to stay pretty for men, but not so pretty that you tempt them too much or that you threaten other women, because you're supposed to be a part of the sisterhood, but always stand out and always be grateful. But never forget that the system is rigged, so find a way to acknowledge that, but also always be grateful. You have to never get old, never be rude, never show off, never be selfish, never fall down, never fail, never show fear, never get out of line. It's too hard, it's too contradictory, and nobody gives you a medal or says thank you. And it turns out, in fact, that not only are you doing everything wrong, but also everything is your fault.
Kia ora and welcome to the Rainbow Umbrella, the podcast where we talk about anything and everything under the rainbow. On this episode, I am joined by Dr. Rebecca Stringer, Senior Lecturer in Gender Studies at the University of Otago, and we're going to talk about Barbie. Welcome, Rebecca. It's awesome to have you here.
It is awesome to be here. I'm really looking forward to our talk.
Yeah, this is going to be fun.
There's a lot to cover.
There is. So, I mean, Barbie, where do we even start? Like, from my perspective, it seems to be a very polarising film. The korero I've had with people, they either love it or they hate it. What do you think?
I agree. There is that polarisation going out there. There's a kind of frenzied joy. And then we have the likes of Ben Shapiro burning Barbies and, reacting in that negative way. So, yeah, I think there is this polarising thing, and it's been like such an event. It's provided occasion for all kinds of discussions around feminism and gender, particularly. With a whole mix of reactions. So it's familiar territory for me because you're used to sort of feminism having that polarising effect. Mm-hmm. And I do think it's a film where kind of Mattel and the makers have kind of embraced at least a certain version of feminism, right?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, the responses to that are kind of the familiar ones. But yeah, there's a lot of thoughts really that it brings up. So I feel like, we should discuss the film, and we also should talk about Barbies and how they're produced.
Oh, yeah.
The plastic that they're made out of, and sort of the relationship between the film and the toy.
Okay.
So, yeah, they're kind of where my thoughts go to. But, yeah, the polarisation is really interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, and I mean, like I said, everyone that I've spoken to has either really enjoyed it or really been like, no, this is problematic for XYZ reasons, which, we'll cover shortly. But for me, I think the most fun aspect of it is the nostalgia. Like, there are things about it that definitely I could discuss, but like within the first opening sequence, I was like, I had that Barbie and I had that Barbie and I had that Barbie. Like, it was familiar.
Yeah.
And the fun little bits where she first steps out of her shoes, but her feet don't go down, like silly little things like that were just fun.
Oh, yeah.
And so even, problematic aspects aside, it's still a fun film and there's still joy to be had in it, which I think is really important. Like, we're not trying to completely destroy the film because it is what it is and it's good for what it is. But
it's interesting that you say that, because that's really speaks to my sort of response to it too. For me, because I don't generally do media, there can be a kind of fallout for someone like me doing media, and I may or may not be up to those angry emails I might get the next day from people. But when I was asked to do some Barbie media, it felt entirely approachable for me. And I noticed that. I thought, I'm going to be making critical points around, how Mattel operate and the way this film might cover over some of the less pleasant things about the reality of Barbie dolls. So I'm going to be making those critical points but I have sufficient comfort to actually put myself into the media space and say yes to media requests because it's Barbie. And this, I played with Barbies when I was wee. I had that whole collection going and did the whole Barbie thing. And so the biographical link was significant for me. So yeah, same. And I think a lot of people are feeling that. They're these things that were so important to our childhood that carry that amazing kind of magic of nostalgia. And yet on the other hand, we also need to look at, the politics of the situation.
Yeah.
So we bring to it a divided self and an interestingly divided self. I actually I really enjoyed that about the film. I thought this is so interesting as an experience to have.
And I want to touch on your Mattel point in just a second, but as you were saying that, I had a thought. I was like, are we capitalising on nostalgia now by doing films like this? Are we taking things that, you see reboots of all of these things coming out, like, all of the new films are like, oh, let's remake this or let's reboot this. And it's like, cool, I'm going to see that because that reminds me of my childhood. But do we really need to do that?
Yeah. And I'm wondering, is it what happened for people with the Transformer films? Was there something similar going on there that, that film that speaks to your childhood or to the kid in you, the Hollywood blockbuster who's addressing a kind of multi-age audience, but also thinking of that adult age audience as people who are going to be remembering their childhood. And I think they are capitalising on that. Cinema goes to work on us and it goes to work on our hearts and our minds. It's such a powerful instrument of communication. So yeah, and they do think about this. They do think who's going to come to this and what are we hoping to address here, and what have we got for those people who come in? So I'm sure there is a play on nostalgia, a capitalising on nostalgia.
And I mean, it's, we're not going to go too far down this rabbit hole, but it's even a situation where, it's targeting future generations as well, because parents might take their children like, oh, I used to watch this when I was a kid, I'm going to bring you and we can share this together, which is a beautiful thing. But then it's like, right, are you hooking in another generation to this thing? And that would lead quite nicely into your point about Mattel and the capitalisation of Barbie and the production of Barbie, because it's like, if you're hooking a generation into a new thing, you can sell merchandise from that, can't you?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And the whole mother-daughter connection, the woman played by, the character played by America Ferrara and her daughter. So the whole matriarchal kind of handing down of this love of the Barbie doll, and that being something, in our family we have this thread, at a time when it's hard to hold families together in this economy. And the thought that by purchasing the same, for your kids, the same dolls you had, that maybe you're shoring up a sense of a family line. I think that is one of the elements here, and that it's strongly played on in the film, because of course there's the mother-daughter, and then of course there's Barbie with her sort of mother, her creator. So there's the whole play on Pinocchio, and the toy meets the maker.
Yeah.
And so I think that's sort of another element of it somehow, this notion of an older matriarch handing down to a younger. So yeah, I think that is very present. But in terms of how do we approach our critique here? It's a successful comedy. I enjoyed the film. I liked the film. I liked the experience of the film. I loved what was happening in the cinema when I saw the film.
Yeah.
It was one of those kind of post-COVID things. Really, we should all have been wearing masks.
Yeah.
The pandemic is still happening. But there was this wonderful sense of celebration and party, and to see all of these people dressed in pink, and to see the investments that they have made very deeply. I respect that. And so, while I want to critique Mattel and include the film in the critique, I also, I'm not here to kind of ruin the fun, as it were.
Yeah.
I think that's very real, those experiences that people have had. Particularly, big groups going together to the cinema after we just exactly could not do those things for, a good 2.5 years. So, yeah, there was kind of a post-COVID joy in there too. All the joys, really.
Yeah, I can imagine seeing it at the cinema would have been a pretty awesome experience.
It was really something. It was sold out, and I was actually, I thought, will I get in? I wanted to see the 6:30. No, it's sold out, and I managed to get like one of the last tickets for the 8 p.m. slot.
Yeah.
So this was in the height, that first kind of release where they kind of banked the billion, where they've done. Isn't it record success for Warner Brothers, I gather? So that speaks also to the power of this movie and to the brand. I think that it can't have been that successful without it really inhabiting our hearts and minds.
Yeah.
Barbies and Kens inhabiting our hearts and minds. So yes, they have definitely capitalised on it, and they've done so successfully.
Just pulling on that thread a little bit, do you think the anticipation and the hype coupled with that nostalgia has added to the success of the film, in terms of like, if it wasn't so hyped up, if it wasn't something that maybe tugged on, the heartstrings of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people, it wouldn't have been as successful?
Absolutely. And, I was thinking, because the great rival of the Barbie is the Bratz doll, right? And I think they might even been made by the same people. I mean, I'd have to check that out. I mean, I don't know if it's a rival brand. But you can't have... The Bratz wouldn't take the world by storm in quite the way that this has.
No.
So there is something kind of special to the Barbie brand that enabled that capture, I think. Yeah. Yeah, and it was just huge.
So you mentioned earlier that you did some media for the Barbie film. You were interviewed for Breakfast TV, and in the interview you mentioned a couple of things about the film that were standout and significant to you. So the environmental impact of Barbie, and how this relates to Barbie as a film, so a digital filmic presence versus a physical presence. As well as the fact that for those that actually make the Barbie dolls, Barbie is work, not play, like she is for those that don't make it.
Yeah.
Do you want to have a chat about those ideas?
Oh, yeah. I mean, first one, of course, that comes up is, Barbie, of course, is plastic. So Barbies are made of polyethylene plastic, which is the kind of plastic that, that's what a lot of household plastics are made out of. It's a relatively stable form. And so they can go ahead and make these kind of enduring objects out of it. And the problem, of course, with polyethylene plastic is that it's utterly toxic for our environment, right? So we now know that we have plastic right through our land and sea environments. We've got it in our own bodies, our own corporeal environments, in our blood system, and there's, in our blood and things like that. Those studies have been done to show that, plastic is the new element almost that modernity has introduced into the environment. So Barbie brings that kind of heritage of the use of plastic, and is part of the destructiveness of the plastic, right? So Mattel do what I call greenwashing, so they're now saying that Barbies are made out of recycled polyethylene plastic. And so the Barbies you buy now have previously been something else. But, it's very much a kind of petrol economy driven, line of production. It's toxic in the process of production as well. So, I gather in terms of Barbie production, in terms of how Mattel have been doing this, so Barbie dolls themselves have never been made in America. What they make in America are the moulds, so the moulds are provided from there, manufactured in the States. But over the years, Mattel have been really, really good at finding cheap labour. So they've been kind of looking for and using cheap labour sources in Southern and Eastern Asia for a long time. So they're one of those multinational corporations that picks up and moves to wherever the cheap labour is. So as it is currently, there are many Mattel-owned factories in China. Each of them have, thousands of employees. So they're not just making Barbies, but they're making other things as well. There's an intense labour watch. There's China Labour Watch, and those people go into the factories. They have ways of actually finding out what's going on in the factories, and then they report. So if you look at their reports, you'll see that Mattel don't score well.
Right.
So there was a study done of one of their factories, the Foshan Nanhai Mattel factory, where there are 3,000 workers. The workers there are mainly women making Barbies. They face unsustainable workloads without a kind of credible system of complaint or coming back around that. There's a real problem with sexual harassment.
Right.
And there are no ways to really complain and have a complaint carried through to a satisfactory solution. There's documented extra pressure put on women workers. Their male colleagues tend not to face the same pressures. So when line managers get angry and want to get the workers to work harder, they focus that R at women.
Oh, okay.
The union isn't independent, and so you can't kind of run off to the union and expect support. There are concerns too about the handling of the hazardous materials. So this is kind of right. This is the real world of Barbie, and it's really the real world that consumers of Barbie, and certainly the Barbie movie, doesn't even credit. Right? We don't credit this on the daily, and this is why I insist that we drop the curtain on this and actually look. So it's hazardous materials that they're using, hazardous glues and things like that. They may or may not be wearing their mask. They may or may not be wearing their gloves. So there's evidence of that being quite patchy. So the safety regulations are in place, but whether they're actually being used is another question. And they also found evidence of things like, if ever there was a fire, they have fire drills, but their processes aren't that safe. So in other words, in all sorts of ways, Barbie is the product of working environments that would be just utterly unacceptable for the people who are consuming those Barbies and buying them for their kids for Christmas. If those people actually had to kind of work a day in these factories, they would start to look very differently upon this product. So that is the sort of necessarily from Mattel's perspective hidden story of Barbie. I was quite annoyed when I saw some reports, people saying, amazingly, the Barbie film is popular in China. Who knew? How could they express such interest in American culture? And I thought, wow, that's what you get when you have people just completely not conscious that, there'd be thousands of kids in China being able to say, yeah, my mum makes Barbie dolls.
Yeah.
It's about a team of about 12 people make a doll. The hardest job, I gather, is painting the face. That's the high pressure moment. They work really long hours. They generally can't leave. And a lot of these factories, they're indentured labour. So they stay overnight, So there would be generations of women and their kids in China who have enormous investment in Barbie as workers.
Yeah.
And the Western media is surprised that people in China have gone to see the film.
That's such an interesting dichotomy in terms of...
Excuse my coughing.
No, you're fine. Interesting dichotomy in terms of the connection to Barbie, though, because you've got a significant group of people that have attachment to it because someone in their family has made it, or they know someone that has made it.
Yeah.
And then there's a whole other group that are like, I used to play with this as a kid. I can get them for my kids or relations or friends' kids or something like that. And it's such a polarizing dichotomy because, as I said before, for some it's play, but for some it's work. Like, this is a toy that is designed to be played with, but for a significant group of people, Barbie is just work. Barbie isn't play.
And it's work like we wouldn't recognise it. You know, it's minimum condition, hard out work. Work where kind of workplace unfairness is the workplace. It's not this shining exception and people are horrified. That is how it is on the daily. And so that really gives me pause when it comes to celebrating Barbie and the film. That's, I guess, what makes it, you know, that notion of the guilty pleasure? Usually it's the idea that one has indulged in one too many chocolates, you know. Actually, I think there's kind of a guilty pleasure around the Barbie film.
Yeah.
And the Barbie doll. And so usually when we think about feminist critiques of Barbie, what everybody bolts to is the notion of these, you know, cis heteronormative gender norms, and how Barbie sets out these unrealistic beauty ideals, and most people who identify as women are going to feel inadequate in the face of those ideals. And I get that, and there's a whole self-esteem story that goes with that. And I think that's one where Mattel feel like they've got a bit of wriggle room. I think they're like, no, we can take on these themes, and we see those themes powerfully worked through in the film. So that's a kind of feminist interest and dialogue around Barbie, potential critique of Barbie that Mattel can handle. But what they couldn't handle is the whole let's just drop the curtain on what you're actually doing to put these out into the world. So this is where we come upon the question of, is Barbie a film or is it an advertisement?
Yeah,
You know,
that's a really good point.
Is it an extended advertorial? I think I saw someone on the net had actually made something. I didn't actually watch it, but I saw the title. Is this a film or an ad? And I was like, that is a really good question. That is kind of the question in a way, because they're telling the story of Barbie, incorporating these feminist themes. It looks like Mattel has decided that it's agreeing with the feminist critique of the heteronormative gender norms. And Mattel is happy to entertain that critique. But yeah.
But for me, the addressing of that felt kind of token.
Yeah.
It felt really, really token. It's like, okay, you have one Barbie in a wheelchair, you have some Barbies in position of power, you know, President Barbie, that sort of thing. You have a pregnant Barbie, you had all of these things. But it felt like, yeah, from my perspective, it felt like they were just there because Mattel was very aware that it's like, hey, actually, thinking has changed. We need to appear to be more inclusive, but are they really? The fact that, you know, America Ferrera's character still had to create Barbies that felt more authentic to her. You know, she's sitting there doodling at her desk. She's, you know, coming up with these other Barbies, and it's like, well, I can relate more to that Barbie than, you know, I'm not president of anything, I'm not a doctor, but it's still like, you know, no, this feels like a real life Barbie. Yeah, and I mean, you know, there will be people out there that, you know, President Barbie or, you know, wheelchair Barbie or, you know, whatever you want to call them, all these different versions of Barbie. Like, it's great that they're there and, you know, people can see, hey, look, this Barbie is more like me. But there's still so far to go. There was still that need for creation of a Barbie that was relatable to a group of people.
Yeah. And I think what we're seeing is they're doing diversity, but they're not doing intersectionality.
Yep.
So they're doing liberal diversity. And that is that token element. So one thing that I think we could consider here is, you know, I watched this panel. So it's Greta Gerwig and Margot Robbie and Ryan Gosling and America Ferrera. There were some other actors there too, and Issa Rae, who played the president. And they were all talking about, it kind of gave an insight into the production culture of the film. You know, there's the film and then there's the story behind the film. We're all too aware of the question of production culture in the post-Me Too era, aren't we? So it gave an insight into the production culture. So here's the thing. They were talking and reminiscing about how wonderful it was practicing that dance together and making the dance. That was obviously like an enormously skilled thing. I thought that dance sequence was extraordinary, you know, a real kind of cinematic triumph, you know. And they were talking about their experiences of it. And Issa Rae, who had played the president, therefore you would think the most important person in Barbie Land as the president, even though the joke is that nothing goes wrong in Barbie Land, so the president doesn't have much of a job to do, right? So that's why our African American president is in the background, I guess, right? But then, you know, Issa Rae spoke up and sort of said, well, I'm paraphrasing here, this was more or less her point, I had a different experience, you might remember, of that whole thing. So it turned out that she had been flown in for particular parts of the production where she featured. She'd learned the whole dance routine, but then upon arriving at the set, she discovered that they had changed the routine.
Right.
So she had to jump right on in and learn that changed routine. And the impression I got was that she was an afterthought within the production culture. So they get to say, look how enlightened we are. We have this woman of colour who is president. We affirm Black Lives Matter. We are onto it. We are doing diversity. And yet within the production culture, Issa Rae's story is one of kind of being behind and not getting the correct information and showing up and having to learn it all. And I just thought, you can't do that. You can't get away with that. And mind you, Issa Rae was not complaining. She was merely saying, she was like, oh, hang on, remember I had quite a different experience of that. She wasn't complaining, but I want to complain on her behalf about that. I kind of think, hang on, this has to be if you're going to do diversity, you need to really do diversity. It's not about adding people on screen who are going to make you look good the way you want to look. So I found that a really disturbing aspect of it. And of course, the story of Barbie, of course, she begins as a white Barbie doll. So Mattel has had to kind of reckon with really serious issues around race and racism. They can't quite speak it though, can they? And are they even there, given the whole reliance on, you know, a deeply exploited labour force in China? I don't know. I think once you start picking away at this stuff, you find something very different from the joyful pleasure.
Yeah. And I mean, the politics of that whole situation that you've just described, you said she wasn't complaining, but if she wanted to, it possibly for her career wouldn't have been safe for her to. Politically, would it have been okay for her to say anything?
Right.
You know, would she have felt safe and comfortable to say anything?
Yeah. And this is where, I mean, she's a terrifically talented actress, so maybe there was a bit of complaint underneath, you know, that wasn't brought out because of the lack of safety you mentioned. It's almost like I wanted to say this, but without rocking the boat too much. So there is a boat there to be rocked, isn't there?
Yeah, and I mean, that's it. As two white women, are we safer to complain on her behalf or even just have this conversation on her behalf? Like, how is that fair?
Yeah, and the responsibility really was on the makers of the film to create a production culture that wasn't going to do that. I know they're very busy. I know there's a million things to do, but that's exactly when these diversity matters are so important. Because guess who gets forgotten first in all the busyness?
Yeah.
So the busyness can't be a reason. It has to be, wow, we had this big film to make and we took extra care in those moments of busyness, not, oh yeah, we forgot about that, you know?
Yeah, and do you think that in that sort of sense it's probably worth having someone, you know, conversations like this will highlight things that may have slipped through the cracks or, you know, whether deliberately or unintentionally, but have someone whose responsibility is to make sure that everyone is looked after, not just a particular group of people, to make sure that things like this aren't lost in like busyness, blindness, or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, and how possible is it? I mean, I was reading recently about, given the way that the Me Too movement and the sort of issues coming out of Hollywood, given how that impacted, you know, obviously they've had to look at their production cultures, And one of the shifts is that there are now people whose specialisation is to actually help conduct scenes where the actors are called upon to interact sexually. So instead of that kind of being left to chance and to the ego of the director and things like that, there's actually somebody who will be specifically appointed to oversee that, to help oversee that, and to check in with the actors and make sure they're okay. And in the same way, if you've got a film that's going to claim to do diversity, there should be somebody there who makes sure that those moments don't come along, and that everybody on the cast feels equally respected. So there good changes could come.
Yeah. It's interesting that you bring up the point about, if someone has oversight of that when characters or actors need to interact sexually, because in films that I watch where there is, a scene like that, or there's a particularly violent scene, like if it's a horror film or, it kind of takes me out of it, because I always think, what would it be like to act that scene? How difficult or how easy did you find acting that scene? And that always runs through my head when I watch films like that.
Oh, yeah. I mean, when you think of that classic film Alien, and how Ridley Scott, when, it's such a famous cinematic moment, isn't it, when the alien bursts out of John Hurt's tummy, there was a woman actor on set, one of the crew members, and Ridley Scott did not fully prepare her for what was going to happen. He deliberately withheld information about what was going to happen, so that when the camera was on her and it burst out of the tummy, it would be candid shock showed on her face.
Right.
And that harks back to the ways of exploitation cinema,
Yeah.
which of course starts in Australia. That's where the crashes you see really are real. And yes, that body did fly out of the car or off the motorbike.
Right.
So the idea that what the camera's doing is capturing candid moments that are extraordinary. And so we've moved into a very different mode of cinema making, of course. But yeah, using the actors in that way doesn't feel the same to us anymore.
No. Well, I heard a similar thing about Django Unchained. Have you seen that
Oh,
film?
yes, I have.
When Leo smashes the glass, I heard that he actually smashed it, and so when he wipes the blood down, forgive me, I don't know the actress's face, it's real.
Yeah.
And I'm like, if that's true, that's one phenomenal dedication to the role, but on the other hand, how traumatic for her would that have been?
Well, exploitation cinema is huge for Quentin Tarantino. So he is a huge fan of Australian cinema and of the exploitation phase. And there's a similar kind of legends around one of the Sheens who played the lead in Apocalypse Now. That, it's his real blood we see there. So there is a kind of thirst, isn't there, for those candid moments. So production cultures. So it's almost like we're nudging around the realities that Mattel don't want us to see. So there's a question mark over the real dedication to diversity in the production culture. There's a question mark over the production. Is it time for a happy story? I've got a happy story.
Sure. Love a happy story.
I'm just thinking these sobering...
Yeah, but it just made me think, it's like, are they almost, just final point, almost in a way like, look, we made this film, we addressed these sort of things, like, have we done our part now? Like, do we need to do any more? Because, people are still going to want to buy Barbie, people are still going to want to play, if anything, we're using the recycled plastic now, like, we've addressed heteronormative ideas about beauty standards. Is that enough?
Oh, look, I think Mattel's probably very ready to rest on its laurels.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, and they banked $1 billion,
Yeah.
Not that they need to. What with Barbie's selling at 100 every minute.
100 a minute?
Yeah, 100 a minute, right?
That's phenomenal. Has that increased since the film? Do you know, surely?
That's the average for the, I think that was 2015 to this year. That's the average sale rate. So they bank billions every year from Barbie. It's not like they were like, oh, gee, we need to make money, let's get a movie out there.
Yeah.
But I do think they're refreshing and renewing their credibility as, as a thinking, a modern company that is aware of the cultural trends. is aware of the need for diversity. I think that's what they've done, and that's the element of it being an advertorial.
I mean, I'd like to think that they would be cognizant and willing to address those issues, because I like to hope that capitalism isn't that strong to keep them going without addressing all of this stuff.
Yeah. Well, it is interesting that, in a way, the mystery here is how come people are still buying Barbies, right?
Yeah.
So exactly what it is that happened there. So they've stayed profitable not because they have eager consumers. It's because they have cheap labour forces, right? So the women making the Barbies are the reason why they're profitable. It's not because women naturally or girls naturally want Barbie dolls. There's nothing like that going on. There's not a natural gender process we're deferring to. So I think they do need to do this kind of thing to put themselves out there in the best possible light in order to continue to shore up this product that people are still purchasing. I went to the Barbie movie one day, and the next day literally went to South Dunedin Warehouse, and I looked at how there were all of these beautiful big images of Margot Robbie up above the Barbie displays, and then just box after box after box of Barbies. So the warehouse had really refreshed all of their stock. So they need to be supporting that market presence with, I don't know, in that sense, maybe the movie can also be read as, I don't know. It just seems like they are having to do a lot to keep Barbies relevant. Because this is exactly the sort of social context in which Barbie would lose her relevance.
Yeah.
And Ken would therefore lose his relevance with Barbie. Hey, but getting to the happy story,
I was just going to say, do you want to do your happy story?
I just love this story. Do you know about the Barbie Liberation Organisation?
No.
Right. Well, we have to remember them here, right?
Yeah.
So in the 90s, when people were doing culture jamming as a way to kind of interrupt the smooth flow of capitalist commerce, this group of people got together and they purchased a bunch of Barbie dolls that had voice boxes and a bunch of G.I. Joe dolls that had, or action figures, sorry, we're not allowed to call them dolls if they go to boys, action figures with voice boxes. And they did this very diligent work of swapping the voice boxes over. Right.
That's incredible.
And this was a pre-Christmas stunt. So they did the work, they looked after the boxes, they repackaged them, and then they returned them to the stores where they'd purchased them, and they went back onto the shelves. So before Christmas, a bunch of people were buying what they hadn't realised were these altered dolls. Christmas morning comes, the kids open them up, they push Barbie's button, expecting to hear, Barbie's sweet voice, and instead she says, "Eat lead," right? And there's all these kids with their G.I. Joes, and I got my action figure, my boy-appropriate action figure. Let's not call it a doll. I'll push the button, and G.I. Joe says, "Let's go shopping," right? So this got a lot of media attention.
Yeah.
There were the kind of these, media reports about it that you can actually find on YouTube. It's kind of gorgeous. And talking about the disturbance at Christmas, these Barbie dolls who were, saying the wrong things, and these G.I. Joe action figures that were saying the wrong things. And so what they were drawing attention to was the kind of insanity of our gender norms, and the way we are, our what we're selling to kids is really these are gender making. It's not, oh, you're a girl, therefore this is naturally appropriate to you. It's like, let's aggressively girl you.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Let's make sure you know about this thing out there called girl, and that you are aligning yourself with that thing. And so they were really taking Mattel to task for their gender-making dolls. And I thought that was pretty awesome and really brave. And for me, it's kind of a moment in kind of pop culture history that should never be forgotten, you know.
Yeah.
So it's like the BLO the whole way. And of course
Yeah.
there was something of a play there on that is, you know, meaningful for us at the moment, of the Palestinian Liberation Organisation, the PLO. So they were kind of vibing off that a little bit and creating the BLO. But I think we should all remember them and celebrate it. You know, what a moment.
Yeah. I think that's fantastic. And a really beautiful way to kind of sum up the korero that we've had today. You know, there are great aspects of the Barbie film. It brings joy, it brings love, it brings nostalgia, but view it through an intersectional lens. Like there's so much more to it than, you know, what appears on the surface.
Well, I think when something that's feminist is hitting popular culture that isn't from the feminist movement, it represents forms of feminism that the feminist movement has discarded. So I look upon the Barbie movie as kind of doing early 80s white feminism. And there is a nod to diversity, but there isn't any intersectional thinking. So it's a it's kind of feminism of yesteryear, the white feminism of yesteryear. So they're necessarily very out of step with how movement feminists are currently thinking. So that's the other point we should make here too. Like those feminist themes aren't static, and the sense that they make of them is very much a sense that from a feminist perspective is really outdated. That might be what your students come in to a feminist class with. Then by the end of it, they'll be like, oh, okay, right, so we don't think those ways anymore. It's interesting to watch that transformation in gender studies. They come in with a sense of feminism, but usually it's white feminism, you know, and then they'll actually deepen. So that's the other thing to note, is that the versions of feminism we see in popular culture, don't expect them to reflect the complexity of your feminism. Don't expect them to reflect the ambiguity and the openness to change and to nuance and to... Because, I mean, I happen to think feminist thinkers are very creative. I think there's a real restlessness to feminist consciousness. It's never as fenced off and as finalised and as angry and as, you know, bitter as it's depicted. Instead, it's kind of this inspiring realm of thinking about the human and what we're making of the human, and harms that can come from that and joys that can come from that. And so I always like to think, you know, I'll watch a film like Barbie and think, well, you almost came close to something feminist there.
Yeah. Point being, you can watch and enjoy Barbie, but be a feminist too.
Yeah. I mean, Laverne Cox, the first transgender Barbie, they're really trying.
Yeah.
You know.
Thank you so much for joining me here.
Thanks for having me.
It's been a wonderful conversation. We could probably talk for hours, but just go and watch Barbie and see what you think.